Our next speaker is Steve Inskeep, who is the host of NPR's Morning Edition, the most widely heard radio news program in the United States. He co-hosts the program with Renee Montagne and David Green. Known for probing questions to everyone from presidents to warlords to musicians, Inskeep has a passion for stories of the less famous, like the American soldier who lost both feet in Afghanistan, or the Ethiopian woman's extraordinary journey to the United States. Since joining Morning Edition in 2004, Inskeep has hosted the program from New Orleans, Detroit, Karachi, Cairo, Houston, and Tehran. He's investigated the rocket police in Baghdad and received a 2006 Robert F. Kennedy Journalism Award for the price of African oil on the conflict in Nigeria. In 2012, he traveled 2,700 miles across North Africa in the wake of the Arab Spring. In 2013, he reported for war-torn Syria and on Iran's historic election. In 2014, he drove with colleagues 2,428 miles along the entire U.S.-Mexican border, resulting in the much-acclaimed radio series, Borderland. Steve is the author of Instant City, Life and Death in Karachi, a 2011 book on one of the world's great megacities. He is also the author of Jacksonland, a history of President Andrew Jackson's long-running conflict with Chief John Ross of the Cherokee Nation. Please help me welcome Steve Inskeep.
Wayne, thank you very much. Thanks for the invitation to come here. I've really, really loved listening to people today. In fact, I've had such a good time listening, I rather hate to ruin it by talking. But I've been asked to do that, and so I will attempt to do so. As the author of a book about Andrew Jackson, I am grateful to Treasury Secretary Jack Lew for bringing him back into the news just in time for my speech today. I have an opinion, as many people do, about the decision to change the $20 bill to put Harriet Tubman on the front and Andrew Jackson goes to the back. I've heard interesting questions about this. People have asked, why remove Andrew Jackson? Other people have asked, why leave him on the back? I actually think this decision is pretty good. I think it is, I would even say it could be poetic, this decision, because Andrew Jackson is a major figure in American history and also a profoundly flawed figure in American history, one of several presidents who owned slaves, just for starters, and we hardly need mention Indian removal before this crowd. He was also a man who, from time to time, personally chased down escaped slaves who had left some of his multiple plantations in Tennessee and Alabama. So this man who actually chased down and caught escaped slaves is being forced to share the $20 bill with a woman who helped slaves escape. And I think that is a good representation of the way that our country works and it should work. We live in a democracy. It is not the rule of one man or one woman. The great man theory of history is not really supposed to apply here. We're supposed to get in there, come at each other with different ideas, fight it out, and hopefully get to better and better results over time. And so it represents America, really, to have this important figure on one side of the bill and an important figure in opposition on the other side of the bill. In fact, last year, I wrote a New York Times op-ed article in which I made a similar proposal to have two people on the bill, Andrew Jackson and John Ross. I would really have liked it if Secretary Lew had taken my suggestion, because that would have been great for book sales. I still think it's a good idea on the merits. And for the same reason, because I see John Ross as a part of the wider American democratic tradition. And that's what I want to talk with you about today. I don't really need before this crowd to recount very much of the saga of Indian removal, the many decades leading up to the final removal in 1838 of the Cherokees. But I want to focus on one aspect of it that I think is overlooked by the wider public, although I'm sure it is understood by many, if not everyone in this room. And that is that we can think of the Cherokee story as a strand, as a part of the wider American democratic experience. I think for people outside of this room, that really needs to be clarified. If you, from the outside, begin looking at the history of Indian nations in the eastern United States, it begins to seem like a historical dead end. They were there, and then they were brushed aside, and it's not really relevant anymore. Which is the way that Thomas Jefferson saw it, as a matter of fact. He's got a letter from, I think, about 1803, in which he talks about the various ways that history would end for the Indian tribes. He said he would prefer the end of their history come as they incorporate with the United States as citizens of the U.S., but it's okay with him if instead their history ends because by them going out west and disappearing somewhere. Well, here we are in this room with lots of evidence that history did not end. And I, as an American, as a journalist, as a student of our democratic system, have learned a lot in the course of writing this book about what I see as the Cherokee contribution to our national democratic traditions. I focus in this book on John Ross's very long, almost 20-year battle against Andrew Jackson. Let's focus on what Ross's goal was during that time. He was first a rising leader and then the principal chief of a sovereign nation. But it was a nation that had fallen under the protection, in quotes, of the government of the United States. And when you begin to read John Ross's letters, many of the originals of which are right here in the Gilcrease Museum, you begin to see that his goal was to maintain that sovereignty, but within the umbrella of the wider United States. I want to read a little bit here, recounting a trip that John Ross took to Washington, D.C. in 1816. He was part of a delegation, Cherokee delegation, which ended up playing an important role in saving some Cherokee land that was endangered in 1816. At age 26, Ross was not the most senior member of the group, but he was a vital part of it, one of the few Cherokees who had the education and English language skills to debate on equal terms with federal officials. The powerful planter Major Ridge had more influence, but less English. Another leading Cherokee, George Lowry, was the delegate's designated speaker when they visited President James Madison, but was apparently not able to write his name. In the coming years, Ross would travel with many delegations to Washington, and by necessity, he wrote many of their letters and formal documents. On joint letters, he was sometimes the only one of the group who signed his name instead of making a mark. With his gracious manners and white men's clothes, Ross was probably one of the members of the delegation who made a positive impression on local newsmen. But he was frustrated. The Cherokees had fought on the side of the United States during the War of 1812 at the Battle of Horseshoe Bend, among other places. They wanted to claim some credit for that from the United States government. They showed up in 1816 with a lot of business to attend to, and the government was slow to attend to their concerns. So Ross wrote directly to William H. Crawford, who was the Secretary of War. The War Department oversaw Indian affairs. "Brother," he began, 32 days have now elapsed since we arrived at the seat of the American government. We hope you will no longer delay. Though the Secretary of War was one of the capital's imposing figures, Ross lectured him. During the late war, we availed ourselves of an opportunity to prove attachment to the government of the United States. Yet some of our white brethren on the frontier wish to remain insensible of it. With multiple statements like this, over the next 20 years, Ross laid a moral foundation for his cause. He foreshadowed the later arguments of African Americans, who in generations to come would also argue that their service in war had proven their claim to equal rights. And it was during these negotiations that Ross informed an official at the War Department, "We consider ourselves as a part of the great family of the Republic of the United States," adding the Cherokees were willing to sacrifice everything in the Republic's defense, not realizing that they would later be asked to sacrifice all of their land, but making a powerful statement that he felt himself a part of the United States. This to me is vitally important and distinguishes John Ross from some other Native leaders of the period. Other Native leaders wanted out of this new and spreading country. They wanted out. John Ross, as leader of the Cherokees, wanted in. And that, to me, makes him a vitally important figure, because he was, in effect, a member of a racial minority seeking to play on an equal footing with the white citizens who dominated the country. And even though the legal issues between Native rights and African American rights, or the rights of other groups in later generations, are very different, in my mind, the moral cause is quite similar. And you begin to see those similarities the more that you get into the history, and you begin to see more and more tactics, as we'll discuss, that John Ross and other Cherokees used that foreshadow tactics that African Americans would use to fight for their civil rights on the very same ground. I'd like to read another bit here. Facing powerful demands for Cherokee land, John Ross knew that he could not simply refuse. He must offer an alternative. This is the period in the 1820s when the state of Georgia was intensifying its demand for Cherokee lands. Around the time of Georgia's political eruption in 1824, Ross joined with other Cherokees to write down a suggestion that contained a hint of humor, even mockery. The Cherokees said that if Georgia needed more land, it should forget about the Cherokee Nation and take over part of Florida. He added that if the Cherokees were ever to come under state authority, it should be a state of their own. Ross proposed the Cherokees should someday enter into a treaty with the United States for admission as citizens under the form of a territorial or state government. A year later, in 1825, Ross and two other Indian leaders fleshed out this vision. If Cherokees remained where they were, quote, the day would arrive when a distinction between their race and the American family would be imperceptible. Of such a change, the nation can have no objection. Even racial distinctions, he wrote, could be overcome. Complexion is a subject not worthy of consideration in the effectuation of this great object. The Cherokees would happily, quote, extinguish traditional culture for the sake of civilization and preservation of existence. The sooner this takes place, the great stumbling block, prejudice, will be removed. In short, they would change almost everything in order to preserve their rights to the land, and in the late 1820s, they built up their political defenses with this vision in mind. Now, clearly, not everyone in the Cherokee Nation agreed with that vision as he expressed it. I'm not sure that everyone in this room would agree with that vision as he expressed it. But he expressed the determination to be seen as an equal to white society, and laid out the possibility of doing so by making the Cherokee Nation, and we saw a map earlier of that, by making that Cherokee Nation a separate territory or state, something like the territory of Florida. It was a territory in that period. Or the newly created state of Alabama. That was his vision. That was his goal. And that was what was opposed by the state of Georgia and other states, and ultimately by President Andrew Jackson. They wanted the real estate. And I go into some detail in this book about the uses of the real estate, and there's been some very useful discussion of that today. There was a huge spread in the cotton farming economy, and the land was needed for that. And the Indians were needed off of the land. It was about land. It was about real estate. It was not about equality. Although white leaders, including Andrew Jackson, in fairness to them, convinced themselves that it would be better for Native nations to be segregated over on the other side of the Mississippi, where they would not be corrupted by white society. This is a very interesting argument. I am ruining your life. You need to leave your home. But there were Cherokees who embraced this argument in time. There were missionaries who embraced this argument in time. It was an argument that was made at the time. But Ross's goal was to be in the system, to be part of the system. And this is the next thing that was news to me, and I think has proven over the last number of months to be news to a lot of Americans, perhaps news to no one here. And that is that John Ross came to battle against Andrew Jackson, this great hero, this great progenitor of the American democratic system, using the tools of the emerging democratic system. Jackson used them very well, was an innovator. He founded the Democratic Party. He created new political coalitions along with some very smart aides like Martin Van Buren. He used the media really well. He subscribed to as many as 17 newspapers at a time. He was an obsessive newspaper reader. He would be constantly checking Twitter today. And he would clip articles and send them to political allies saying, here's an embarrassing fact you can use to smite our enemy. He was an innovator. Ross and the Cherokees were innovators. In this age of expanding printing presses, expanding media, the Cherokees founded the Cherokee Phoenix. Now that's considered culturally significant because the articles were in Cherokee. There was political significance, though, in that they were also in English, and those papers were distributed by exchange, as it was called, traded for papers with as many as 100 other newspapers across the United States. Articles in the Cherokee Phoenix would be clipped and reprinted in other newspapers across the United States, or they would be responded to, or denounced, or referred to in other newspaper articles. They would go viral in the 19th century sense. The Cherokees got the word out using this new democratic tool, the media. When that was insufficient, they went to Congress. They fought in Congress. They came very close to winning in Congress. President Andrew Jackson's first major legislative program, as you will know, was the Indian Removal Act of 1830. This was his first big legislative program. It was his Obamacare. It was his George W. Bush tax cuts. The Indian Removal Act came within a few votes of being defeated in the House of Representatives. Having lost there, John Ross went to the United States Supreme Court. They went once and lost, but the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, John Marshall, sent word in not so subtle ways that if they sued again, but in a different form, that they might win. Ross took the hint and sued and won in 1832. And John Marshall, possibly the most important Chief Justice in history, wrote a very clear ruling stating that the Cherokee Nation had given up certain lands through treaties and wars, conquest and sales over the years, but that they had certain land by treaty reserved to them, and it was their right to govern it as they saw fit, and the state of Georgia had nothing to do with it. It was extremely clear, and as everyone in this room knows, it had no effect in the end. It's said that Andrew Jackson ignored the ruling. It's said that Andrew Jackson said, Chief Justice Marshall has made his ruling, now let him enforce it. This is really interesting. Historians have looked into this. The evidence that Jackson said exactly that is actually pretty thin. Although one scholar, who I cite in the book, went and found that although Jackson did not say that, he said 5 other things that mean virtually the same thing. In the end, Jackson realized he could not ignore the Supreme Court without creating a constitutional crisis, but he engaged in negotiations with the state of Georgia. I won't get into the details here, but engaged in negotiations to make the case go away. It had no effect. Now imagine if that had happened during the Civil Rights era. African Americans tried many of the same steps we just described. African Americans started their own newspapers, got the word out about their own ideas and issues, fought in the Congress, fought in the courts, and ultimately won a huge court ruling in Brown versus Board of Education. Imagine if President Eisenhower had said in 1954, I hate this court ruling, I'm not going to do anything about it. I'm not going to send federal troops to Little Rock, Arkansas, or anywhere else to enforce the integration of schools. History would be very different today. This is what happened to the Cherokee Nation. And so, after a breakaway faction of Cherokees signed the Treaty of New Echota in 1835 and set the stage for removal in 1838, Cherokees under John Ross engaged in what I think we can identify as civil disobedience. They had been told that they must leave their land by May 23rd, 1838. They had seen that several thousand soldiers had been sent to the area or recruited from the area, white soldiers, to escort them out. They had watched these troops moving through the area, improving roads and building stockades so there was a network to gather everybody up and send them out. They had been told in no uncertain terms that the way to save themselves was to follow this treaty, which they considered bogus but had been ratified by the U.S. Senate, and move. In April 1838, 5 or 6 weeks before removal, a federal Indian agent is moving around the Cherokee Nation, and he sees Cherokees planting corn as if they expect to be there in the fall. Cherokees under John Ross's leadership had vowed to simply stay where they were. It may have been the corn planting that finally moved the federal authorities to begin talking seriously with John Ross, who was in Washington at the time. He'd been trying to negotiate with the authorities. He'd realized removal was inevitable, but he wanted to at least improve the terms. They hadn't even been willing to talk to him. But there was something unnerving about Cherokees plowing the same fields that they had plowed for years. White men had said long ago that Indians, quote, in a wandering state, could not really claim land simply because they passed through it while hunting. The way to claim land was to improve it, to build a house, to put up fencing, to work a farm. To become the owner of land in this way was a natural right of man. Indians failed to exercise this right, it was said, except that the Cherokees had done it for decades now, long enough that one half of the Cherokee Nation, those who were under 18, could not remember any other way. Now, in the spring of 1838, the farmers of the Cherokee Nation proved their ownership of the land one more time. White men who missed the philosophical depth of this act of peaceful defiance thought they instead detected madness. Calamity loomed. Faced with the realization that his administration, troops under his command, were going to cause a humanitarian disaster, President Martin Van Buren finally negotiated with John Ross and the Cherokees. It was too late to avoid removal. The land was effectively gone. But Ross at that moment was able to improve the terms, to receive more money on more generous terms, and to receive permission to take charge of the removal himself. Cherokees would move under the direction of their own leaders rather than at the point of a bayonet. Unfortunately, the negotiations to conclude that took all the way up until May 23rd, 1838. And it was going to take 2 weeks to get word to the Cherokee Nation. And in that 2 weeks, the removal began. And it is in that period that we hear stories of troops going house to house, rousting people out of their homes, prodding them down the roads and toward stockades. In the end, it was a humanitarian disaster. But the Cherokee Nation as a whole survived that experience. Every single thing that I've just named that John Ross and the Cherokees did has a parallel in later civil rights struggles. I don't know, I have no evidence that Martin Luther King or other civil rights leaders were able to look back in Native American history and see evidence of this. But it is powerful and symbolic to me that the acts that are so similar took place on quite similar ground. The Deep South. And they both add to our democratic tradition. And they both are very relevant to this country today. We live in an era in which the United States is constantly becoming more diverse, changing very rapidly. And the great overriding challenge we face, a challenge, a historic trend that underlies almost every news story that I cover, is how to deal with that challenge. The change in this nation underlies our politics, it underlies changes in our culture, in society, in our economy, everything. It's in the background all the time. And the big question we face as a society is how do we ensure everyone's individual rights while making sure that we still fit together as one nation? It is helpful, at the least, to understand that this is not a new problem. That the United States was a tremendously diverse nation in the 1820s and 1830s. That the United States faced that same question. How do we ensure everyone's individual rights and make sure we fit together as one nation? Andrew Jackson's answer to that question got him on the $20 bill. It is not well regarded today. We can and should look upon it as a democratic failure, as a failure of the democratic process. But one of the saving graces of democracy is that nothing is ever over. No decision is ever final. We will forever wrestle with that giant question as the country continues growing and changing. And I would respectfully argue that our answers as a country have gradually gotten better over time. Thanks for taking time to listen to me today. I really appreciate it. I don't have the slightest idea what time it is, but I'll take a question if you want me to. Yes. All right? Yes, ma'am. Could you say your name? I want to get to know people just a tiny bit.
Tracy McClellan's room. I'm wondering what was the genesis of this idea that came to write this book? I mean, given your work, which you previously written, and then the correlations to the things about civil rights, etc. Did that come during the book as like, oh, this is kind of precursor?
Oh, yeah, the correlation came during the book because I knew nothing about John Ross when I began 3 or 4 years ago. Just nothing. And I think that I'm the average American in that regard. How did it grow out? How did this story grow out of my current work? I mean, they're very closely connected. 4 or 5 years ago, around 2011, I covered politics a lot in Washington, and I know this will surprise you, I became very depressed about that. Our political system seemed to be a mess, and that drove me back into history, and I dug into the 1830s, which is a period that had always fascinated me as a student of history, and learned more and more about it. and looked at different stories, different dramas of that time, and of all those stories, this is the one that to me feels the most visceral. In 7th grade, or so, give or take a year, in a history class, I learned a little bit about the Trail of Tears in my school in Carmel, Indiana. And as I recall, I can almost see the pages. There were a couple of pages. It was one of those little sidebar boxes, you know, in the history textbook. And there was a picture of Andrew Jackson, who was alluded to have been vaguely responsible for something. And there was this detail about people who were in their homes and were shoved out at bayonet point by soldiers. And it's the kind of detail that sticks with a 7th grader. I don't remember anything else in that history book, actually. It sticks with you, and the reason it sticks with you is because it was an act that was never atoned for. Slavery was, I mean, pick your term, was horrific. And the problem of racism, of black-white relations have not been resolved, but there was a civil war fought. The country faced that problem and dealt with that problem, and this is an act, and the broader period of Indian removal is something that was just never dealt with. It just happened. And what is left is to tell the truth about it. And that's what I've tried to do in this book. Yes, sir, go right ahead. Say your name. Yes.
I'm curious if you uncovered any information about the population shifting, because you alluded to the John Ross wanted the Cherokee Nation to stay in some state or territory of some sort. In my genealogical studies, I have seen the Cherokees were on a speeding train of intermarriage prior to removal, and then removal brought us into a place where it's just us until we began remarrying one another. So do you think that if the Cherokees had remained in the East, that our population would have become what John Ross predicted?
I think that's entirely possible. I can give you a little bit of evidence. It may not be anything you don't already know. There were some missionaries in the 1830s who wrote that even at that early period, they knew of people with at least 6 generations of intermarriage. And they estimated that about a quarter of the nation was mixed blood. And you have to face the reality. It's actually a really fascinating and intriguing idea. What if the Cherokee Nation had been allowed to become a territory? You could just cut off some pieces of Georgia and Tennessee and so forth and just make them a territory and eventually a state. They'd made states out of other states before. But if you were going to make it a state, you would have had to let anybody move there who wanted to move there. And the Cherokee Nation, which was quite small relative to the United States, would have been overwhelmed very quickly. Set aside intermarriage, they just would have been outnumbered. They wouldn't have been in charge of the place very long. And you raise an excellent point. There may have been even more intermarriage at even greater speeds than there was at the time. There were arguments made that staying close to white civilization would destroy the Cherokee Nation as a nation. They may have been right, and that is part of the cold reality of looking at this situation. We can say with certainty that what was done was wrong. It is really hard to come up with the answer that would have been more right in every respect. Perhaps there would have only been other solutions that were different. Yes, ma'am.
Dana Simon, when you say that in the interest of assimilation and in the interest of democracy, how do you account for the denial of immigrants during the Holocaust, Egyptians and Mexicans, and assimilation of Muslims and other refugees? Does that play into what you're trying to say now?
Let me think about that. I mean, they have this common thread of prejudice, all those examples that you give. You say assimilation versus democracy. I mean, I would see those, a great many of those, you could describe them as failures of democracy, which is a messy system, and we screw up a lot, don't we? And we debate things a lot. And I don't mean to minimize those things that you said by just calling them screw-ups. They're horrible. It is a difficult process, as I think many of us are finding out in this election year. The electorate is constantly changing. The people who are involved constantly change. New voters are growing up, old voters are dying, and it's a continual learning process for all of us. And you've just given a record of nightmarish mistakes that I would hope would never be repeated, although some of them may well be, and we'll probably come up with new ones. I don't think that democracy is about getting everything right. I think it's a constant thrashing around in the dark, and things gradually do, I would submit, do get better over time.
We have time for one more question.
Oh, yes, sir.
Compare Jackson and Donald Trump.
Yes. Believe it or not, I wrote about that some weeks ago. People have been asking me that question for months. And I really resisted the comparison for the longest time. But I finally found one way that I felt that they are similar, and it's in their tone. Andrew Jackson, love him or hate him, essentially said, his message was, I'm fighting for my side. I'm fighting for my people, the people I consider to be on my side, my friends, and I will do whatever I have to do, and I don't care who else gets hurt. Which is a powerful political message if you're one of his friends. Donald Trump takes very much that same tone. I'm fighting for our people, and I don't care who gets hurt. We're going to be nasty, we're going to torture people, we're going to do whatever we have to do. And I'm not speaking against Donald Trump, I'm not speaking for Donald Trump, I'm just analyzing here. There is a similarity in tone. There are also differences. And just to give one, Andrew Jackson served decades in government before running for president of the United States. But they were both successful in real estate. That's it, I can't top that.
Thank you, Gary.